Welcome back, everybody, to Critical Conversations, episode number 20.
19, I think.
Oh, man, is it 19? Yeah,
we're close.
No, I think it's 20.
Oh, you might be right, actually. I think it might
This
be
might
20.
be the first time that I'm right and Jared's wrong.
Oh, no.
Episode 20, which would be a landmark. Jared's confirming now.
Yes, I am. So,
welcome. If this is your first time to Critical Conversations, my name is Sam Castles. My co-host, as always, Jared Bessie. And Critical Conversations is a show where we sit down, have some good conversations about current events, news, politics, and just try to take a level-headed approach on it and see through a lot of the noise and the sensationalism behind today's media. What's the final ruling?
we are, in fact, on number 20. So you got it.
Wow.
We hit the
Number
milestone
20.
and you remembered. So
so it's good to have you with us if it's your first time. Today we are talking about Cuba. And kind of a random topic if you look at our past couple episodes. But basically,
we've been doing a lot of news lately.
A lot of news, a lot of politics. This is kind of what I hope will be a bit of a mini series, as we sort of looked into Parliament versus Congress, and we had a little bit of look at different countries. But something I think that is increasingly interesting, first of all, from just an educational perspective, is looking at other countries, what kind of structures they have. There's enough advanced countries now that a lot of comparisons are helpful. We look at different healthcare systems, different voting systems. It's definitely to the advantage of countries to look at what's working for other countries, what isn't working. And there is a lot of noise and conversation about what countries are doing what well and what are doing some things not well. And one that has always been curious is Cuba. It's had a wild history, to say the least.
Crazy history. Like, I knew basics about Cuban history just from, the American eyes parts of it, but I was just reading through a bunch of history yesterday and just overwhelmed with how much has happened there in the last few hundred years.
Right.
It's really crazy.
Yeah. And for me and you, we're younger, we're Gen Z.
Right.
We didn't really we lived through this. We were alive when Fidel Castro handed over power to his brother, and when his brother handed over power, and there was the Cuban Missile Crisis. When was Cuban Missile Crisis?
That was in the 80s, 70s.
So that's before our timeline.
I don't know about you, but it is.
Yeah, that's before us.
62.
Right. There's like the Bay of Pigs, all of this history that older people will probably have lived through and remember. But for us, a lot of it sort of happened before we were even alive. And now it's kind of settled down a little bit. But it was back in the news a lot this week. And that's kind of why we wanted to talk about it for a few different things. But hopefully this can be something that turns into a bit of a mini series where we look at sort of the history and politics of different countries, try to figure out, is this country all it's hyped up to be? I know that, for example, I'd love to talk about Sweden or Norway. They're countries that get talked a lot about here in America as models for healthcare. Countries that have experienced great growth. We could talk about China, talk about Venezuela, a bunch of countries that are important for these philosophical arguments because people love to make examples. And with Cuba, we'll get into this more, but I see that a lot because even in this recent election in Florida, right, we have a lot of Cuban immigrants who fled Cuba when Castro came to power, and now they have kids, and there's a lot of first generation Americans here that are voting, and those Cuban immigrants are still voting. And it's very interesting because they're kind of squeamish about socialism because it's something that they saw in Cuba. And because of that, the right tends to point at Cuba as like failed socialist state, but the left in some ways will prop it up. If you're a socialist, it's complicated, and we'd love to sit down today and sort of break it down as much as we can. Obviously, it's going to be a short video, and it's a long history.
I think this is going to be kind of a fun series just to both increase our own knowledge of other countries, because I feel like often, at least a lot of our education, I feel like, is very American centric. And I took a class in comparative politics, international politics. But I definitely think that there's a whole, I mean, we talked about this in our Congress versus Parliament episode. There's so many other systems and so many other ways to do government out there, and just to live life in general. And so I think it'll be worth looking at some of these countries, just doing kind of broad strokes of like, okay, let's talk about this. What kind of thing, what should we learn more about? What do we want to, get further knowledge on to have these kind of discussions, just so that when these things get brought up, we're not just like, yeah, Cuba, and you just kind of say the bullet points that are, that you think that your side that you agree with says.
Right, exactly. Because the truth is, and I hope that's something that viewers want to walk away with today, is that
Right.
It is extremely complicated, which doesn't mean there's no right answer or that you can't have an opinion or feel you're right. It's just
Right.
that to really speak on the issue, it's a lot more than just socialist nation bad or socialist nation good and, whatever.
Yeah, for sure.
But before we jump into all of that, we're going to start with a little bit of domestic news for the most part.
Yeah.
Do you want to open us up with that first story?
Tom Brady won another Super Bowl. As a New England fan, I was very happy to see him win one more, even though I was sad it wasn't in New England. But yeah, I'm sure everyone knows, and that was fun. Not an exciting Super Bowl, but hey, Tom Brady got his 7th.
Right. Unbelievable. I'm sad because on Sunday I was thinking before we recorded on Super Bowl Sunday, I was like, I'm going to surprise Jared and ask him who he thinks is going to win the Super Bowl. And he's going to say Tom Brady and the Bucks. And then we'll see what happens. But I totally forgot. And I robbed you because you totally would have said the Bucks are going to win.
Actually, I wanted the Bucks to win. And so, but I was pretty confident the Chiefs were going to pull it out.
Really?
So I don't know. Yeah. So I was proven wrong. Although I was pretty confident the Bucks were going to win because I had a cup that I took to church every Sunday that had the Bucks on it, and every Sunday I brought it to church. They didn't lose, and so I brought it the last 7 Sundays of the season, and so they never lost. So
wow, amazing. I picked them to win too. I did a pigskin pick 'em for the playoffs.
Yeah.
I picked them, and but I expected it to be a closer game for sure.
For sure.
Cool.
All right. So one of the other big announcements that happened this weekend is the Dallas Mavericks announced that, or at least Mark Cuban announced earlier this week, that the Mavs have not been playing the national anthem before the games this whole season. And it was just kind of noticed because fans were in the stadium for the first time this week. And as people that are from Dallas, like Sam's from Dallas originally, it was just like, oh, this is really interesting. And so obviously this national anthem in sports has been in the news constantly over the last couple of years, it feels like. So this was kind of a big step. I feel like not often the organization itself has kind of come out like this. Like I know NBA had their big Black Lives Matter kind of movement during the finals last year or throughout the bubble. But I feel like this was kind of the first step.
I feel like in the past it had been limited to we're letting players kneel or stay in the locker room if they want. And that was controversial. And all of a sudden, not playing it at all was kind of unprecedented. I'm sure there's examples of it.
Although the NBA was pretty swift to be like, all teams are required to play the national anthem before the start of the game, as in protocol with league rules. Although I don't know if that will change if owners change their mind like Mark Cuban. So anyway, pretty interesting.
Yeah.
So, that was the first big thing. We had so we've talked a bunch about cancel culture and kind of this, like, people getting fired for things. Another instance that happened, was it this morning or yesterday? Gina Carano, or today, who's the actress who's in The Mandalorian. She's one of the rebels. I don't remember her name in the show, Cara Dune or something.
Yeah, something like that. She's an MMA fighter.
Yeah. She had been pretty right-wing and posted some right-wing things throughout the last couple of months, or last couple of years, I think. And then she had posted something comparing being silenced or being rejected for your beliefs, similar to being in Nazi Germany. And so, of course, people freaked out, and she was fired. So...
yeah, I think it was a couple other tweets, but that one was definitely the...
yeah, it wasn't like, if she'd just done that, I don't doubt it would have happened.
Right.
Like, it was this cumulative effort.
Yeah, right. Of It was nothing, too crazy like QAnon. It was just like kind of a series of like, okay, this is pushing the line for a celebrity, right? Like usually you have to
Yeah,
be pretty.
it's interesting because I feel like there's such a bubble of like celebrities and like Twitter culture and like all of these things because they don't even understand like so much of conservative movement that like I see these kinds of posts all the time from people
Right.
that aren't that, and like so when I read it I was like, oh okay, yeah, I've seen this kind of thing before. Like it
Yeah.
wasn't that surprising, and I think it just shows you like how, you know, in the bubble that part of the country is, or that part of
Right.
society, which yeah, anyway.
Twitter is its own kind of the world. Like I think it's really curious. This is definitely just my opinion, but I feel like a lot of international people who have opinions about America, they see Twitter and they see like Facebook or whatever, and they think all Americans are like what's on Twitter, and
Yep.
it's really interesting because it's just a very small subsection of the world, really, that's on Twitter and posts on Twitter.
Yep. Yeah,
So
it's crazy.
curious. Last bit where is the impeachment is fully into the Senate now, so that's been going on this week. The House obviously impeached. It's been like 2 weeks ago, and then they took a 2-week pause to sort of
Yeah,
bail out a bunch of
almost a month
Biden.
ago now.
Yeah, almost a month ago. Biden appointees and kind of the first round of the Biden administration, and now they are hearing arguments about impeaching Trump. Or
Yeah, there
not
was a lot of
convicting. Yeah.
convicting Trump. Yeah, so the impeachment is technically over, but now it's about the
Right.
conviction. So this is the trial portion as opposed to just a vote on impeachment. Um, but yeah, I mean, there was a lot of drama over all of like 5 of Trump's attorneys quit a few days before the trial began, and so that was kind of a whole thing. And then this week, there's just been a lot of chatter about Senate Republicans not taking it very seriously, and so it's just a pretty interesting thing to keep your eye on. I don't think it's going to matter because I don't think they have 60 votes, and I don't think they ever had 60 votes. They took the ruling to declare it unconstitutional, and 4 or 5 senators agreed that it was, or that it wasn't unconstitutional to go forward. So that's why. So it would have passed either way if that's a true majority vote.
Right.
But I doubt there's going to be 5 more that are going to vote to convict.
Yeah, very, very unlikely. So it'll be about another few days of just kind of, I don't know. I don't want to say drama, but just presentations, and they're going to run Trump's name through the mud as much as possible, even if they don't think they're going to get a conviction. And
Right.
I think it's always been a bit about sending a message because it's pretty clear that Republicans are not going to convict him, but
yeah,
that's worthwhile to the Democrats, so that's what they're going to do.
Yep. I think that's it for the news. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's it. There is some current Cuba news that sort of first put this on the radar. It's kind of been a busy month for Cuba. Something that happened really recently in the past, I think it's 4 days, is that Cuba announced it will allow private business to operate in most sectors instead of what it was very limited to before.
It was just tourist sectors before, right? So these kind of small little areas, right? And now
yeah, I think so.
Much broader.
You should definitely, if you want to look up into the weeds about which economic activities, but basically the idea is Cuba has been socialist or communist, whatever, like the labels are complicated, but it's been state controlled, most of the large industries for a long time.
Yeah.
And it has just struggled economically speaking, and we'll get into sort of some of the details behind that struggle for years. But after this pandemic hit, it in my eyes, this is sort of crying uncle and saying, all right, we have to sort of let this more people open up and try to create some economic growth, some movement.
Yeah, apparently it fell. The GDP fell 11% last year during the pandemic, and which isn't, a lot of countries have been hit really hard, but for Cuba, this was like their first huge downturn in 30 years, like this much, and so it was kind of a wake-up call, I think, to be like, okay, something needs to change, and so they're hoping this will influx economic growth. So
yeah, And then last month in the news, basically the Trump administration added Cuba to the list of state sponsors of terrorism. So this is basically, I don't know, proverbial naughty list as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I was like, I don't really know what that means. Obama took him off of that because they were on it for a long time.
Right. They had been on it since I think the 80s, and Obama had finally taken it off. Right.
Yeah, and I feel like that's just posturing at that point. If Trump's going to do that, kind of his last few months last month in office, it's like, okay, I don't know. Interesting.
Right. Yeah, and it's kind of in the last few years, like we said, Obama had taken them off, and Obama had reopened the U.S. embassy in Cuba, and I think Wikipedia says that Trump had closed it. So, although I'm kind of unclear on that. So,
yeah, it's just interesting to note that just since 2015, U.S. citizens have been allowed to travel to Cuba. So it's really not very long, 5-6 years. Not a long time.
So I was kind of curious. I knew a little bit about Cuba, but I had not really done any deep dive into it. And with all of this recent news and Cuba being, a socialist country, I have heard in the past, like we talked about a little bit, the right will slam Cuba and its economic turmoil as like an example of failed socialism, but the left, the more like radical socialism or whatever you want to call it, the farther left wing will hold up Cuba as a good example and say that it has its issues, but largely it would have worked if not for this years and years of tension between the Cuban government or Cuba as a nation and the U.S. I thought we could break down a little bit of the history of Cuba and sort of talk about how it got to where it is today.
Yeah, so it's kind of crazy.
Yes.
I mean, originally found by Columbus way back when, Cuba has been an integral part of U.S. kind of history and this kind of the Americas since the beginning. And then Spain got involved and was the kind of main
occupier, I guess.
Occupier, for a long time. But yeah, there's just a ton of crazy history that went on through the 1800s.
Yeah,
and the 1900s again.
Right.
Crazy.
Yeah, it sort of feels like your prototype for small nations that got just destroyed by imperialism, and it was Spain had it, the Brits were there for a bit, U.S. was there.
The Monroe Doctrine kind of was applied, because that was saying, that European nations could not take anything in the Americas, but Cuba was an exception to that because it was Spain already has it, so I guess it's fine. But then they wanted to be annexed to the U.S. because Spain was they were kind of getting fed up with the people there. Anyway, it's just a lot of craziness.
Yeah, and when the Spanish were occupying Cuba in the early days, they imported slaves from Africa, and now there's a large African population, Afro-Cuban population. And it's just a really rich history and a really sad history in a lot of ways. Just so many years of human rights violations and wars over and over.
Yeah, I mean, they've got so many different kind of war. I mean, there's several wars for independence throughout their history, several uprisings, coups, some bloodless, some not.
Right. So we can talk a little bit about basically the more recent history. I mean, the Spanish occupied it for a long time.
Right.
And then, let's see.
They left in 1898. So it was handed over temporarily to the U.S. in beginning of 99.
Right.
And basically the U.S. was did what they did a lot in that era, was to kind of take over. Okay, we're in charge. We will help you set up a democracy. We'll get you constitution written. We'll get you all these things. And then we'll kind of put a person in charge and then kind of hands off. Although hands off being very vague, and still we're going to still import a lot of things, and we're still going to tax you, and we're still going to do a lot of stuff.
Yeah, it's the U.S. I guess has a very complicated history of like being in the occupying a territory and having this. I mean, Congress had debates over what to do with Cuba. Like, it was kind of represented the imperialist versus anti-imperialist debate of that time. Like, even
Right.
I think with the Civil War, there was northern states who wanted to just liberate Cuba and let it kind of be governed by its own people, and then the southern states that were pro-slavery wanted to sort of stay in charge of Cuba and treat it as, like a nation that they could protect U.S. interests from. And the sugar is like a huge export from Cuba, and that was something that the Americans definitely used for years.
Yeah, sugar was super important for their whole getting tariffs, and the Cuban sugar gave like a significant edge to the American market, so it became very important.
Right. Yeah. So once the U.S. pulled out.
Yeah, so that was kind of early 1900s, kind of after it was transferred over. There was some presidents, and it was independent, but then kind of didn't really work. There was a revolt, and so the U.S. kind of stepped back in. And then World War I hit, and there was a whole bunch of other stuff going on. Let's see what else happened.
Yeah, so let's see. Basically in World War I, they had a president named Geraldo Machado. And
he won, but then was barred, and then basically the Platt Amendment is what said, correct me if I'm wrong, it was like that we could like come into other countries that needed help, but basically we decided not to interfere in that, and so nothing ended up happening. And then basically World War II kind of like came in, and there was just a lot of craziness.
Yeah. So I think the big thing is after in 1940 they had a big election, right? And this guy Batista, I don't know how to say his first name, Fulgencio,
yeah.
He was endorsed by the Communist Party at first, and he basically won this election and was the president of Cuba. But then the communists sort of like declined, and Batista started to become very like, even though he had a progressive constitution, and like they even really back as early as 1940, they were wanting to promise national healthcare for everyone, and there was a lot of like labor union focus,
right,
human rights things. But Batista basically started to become a lot less communist. Like, I think he ended up outlawing the Communist Party. Is that right? Let's see.
Oh, I don't know. I didn't read that, but yeah, it kind of like switched over, and then they were like hanging with us in like the late 40s, early 50s. And so there was the leader in the early 50s, Partito Ortodoxo, which was part of this liberal democratic group.
Right.
And he was expected to win, but he committed suicide. So that was unfortunate. Yeah, that was Eduardo Chivas. And so that kind of like, since he was gone, there was just like a whole bunch of, there was another bloodless coup a few months later, and so it's just like still kind of crazy.
Yeah, because at some point, Batista was, let's see. Yeah, here we go. Bautista, while they were recovering from all of this, he suspended the Constitution and revoked a lot of political liberties, including the right to strike. And then eventually it reached the point where most of the sugar industry was in the U.S. hands, and foreigners owned 70% of the arable land. Arable, I don't know. And basically, Batista was like working with a lot of U.S. and, like you said, buddy. But then when people started complaining and like the poor were getting poorer and the rich were getting richer, Batista established tighter censorship of the media, and he used this Bureau for the Repression of Communist Activities and basically just outlawed like communism and censorship. And that's when we start having Fidel Castro and I don't know how to say it ever. Guevara. And yeah, we can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so basically, so then it hit the Cuban Revolution when we got to the mid-50s, and it was just kind of these revolutionaries kind of starting up, and there was already kind of this culture of, we don't know what's going to happen. We've had so much turmoil in the last couple of years, whether it's communists or whatever. And so this guy who was super popular, or like was super charismatic, just kind of, they organized this movement, overthrew Batista in 50s, and basically attacked. And then eventually this kind of like, they failed at first, but it kind of kept going on. And then Batista was forced to flee in the late 50s, 1959, and Castro eventually took over. So it's kind of this ongoing kind of like revolution that slowly built. And once the U.S. kind of was like, we don't know what's going on, so we're going to put some more trade restrictions on you. That kind of was the end of of Batista's administration.
Yeah, because it was right, like this 40s, early 50s era where communism was starting to become like enemy number one in the eyes,
right? Because it switched from the Nazi party and like all of this kind of stuff. It became all about communism.
Yeah,
as the U.S. learned more and more. So
USSR was starting to grow, and the U.S. was becoming more and more worried about the USSR. So, but Batista, who was in charge, was anti-communist, and because of that, the U.S. highly preferred that Batista stayed in charge, even though he was kind of terrible and he did a lot of things. But he got financial, military, and logistical support from the U.S. But basically, as he continued to fight with Fidel Castro, and this revolution just kept going, they sort of outlasted Batista. And basically, the U.S. decided, okay, well, we kind of tried to stop this Communist Party from coming to power. It didn't really work. And then once Fidel Castro was in power, the U.S., like you said, started to be a lot more hostile towards Cuba.
Well, yeah, so it's interesting when that kind of transition took place, that was when like thousands of Cubans fled to the U.S. So they were kind of, all of these people that were fans of Batista's kind of more, less communist type, more westernized stuff, they were like, oh my gosh, if Castro's taking over, it's time for us to get out of here. And that's kind of what makes up the most of the Cuban population.
Fleeing to Florida, right?
Yep.
And because those were the people, like we said, Batista, he was allowing a lot of like U.S. trade and U.S. companies to take root in Cuba. And I think a lot of people were getting rich from the U.S. intervention, U.S. companies there. But Castro's like rallying cry was how much it was hurting the poor. And again, like Batista there were not very many civil liberties. And it was just a tough time for poverty in Cuba. So just a complicated past there.
And then once Cuba took over, the U.S. was like, okay, we recognize you, that you're a thing. Eisenhower sent an ambassador. But then pretty quickly, the Eisenhower administration was like, okay, we need to do something about this because this is, communism's becoming more and more unliked. Like, this is bad.
And Fidel Castro was no friend of the
No, he did
U.S.
not like the U.S. So the U.S. was
I
kind
mean,
of like, yeah, we recognize you, mostly because they wanted to maintain some level of trade. And but Castro was like, no, the Western imperialism, like, this is not.
and he had kind of been screwed over by the U.S. providing arms and aid to Batista for years. So,
Right, which makes sense.
right,
You're not immediate friends with the people that helped your predecessor.
right,
Which eventually led to the Bay of Pigs in the early 60s. And this was, regarded as one of the most disastrous military engagements that the U.S. has ever had. It was basically, we sent this huge array of troops to invade Cuba. Did not go as planned. I'm sure most of you know the basics on the Bay of Pigs. But it was,
yeah.
a
But
huge plot by the
it
CIA.
wasn't even like U.S. troops. It was Cuban exiles. So
Yes.
a lot of the people who fled Cuba when Castro came to power was, Castro was very, like, he's the one who wanted to get rid of all of these rich. So, like, the rich and friends of Batista were being killed, being shot. Like, it was not a good time to be a rich friend of Batista. So all of these guys ran to Cuba, or ran to Florida, and were part of this Cuban exile group that wanted to overthrow Castro. So yeah, I guess the CIA or the U.S. worked with these exiles to get the Bay of Pigs invasion going, which failed, like you said, failed miserably. They questioned these Cuban exiles, figured out the U.S. did this, and then Kennedy took like full responsibility, and
Right.
Kind of a disaster.
Yep. That led to, not long later, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was basically the USSR started to get more and more influence in Cuba, and they placed long-range nuclear weapons on Cuba, and that led to, the real initial strokes of the Cold War,
right?
Which would last
Because
the next 25 years.
After all of this years of tension with the U.S. and there was trade restrictions, the Castros knew that, like, okay, well, we're communists. We're sort of on terrible terms with the U.S. We're going to become buddy-buddy with the USSR. So they were communists at the time. They also had like alliances with Venezuela. And even though Cuba was poor and struggling in a lot of ways, they still found time to fight in a lot of USSR-sponsored wars overseas. And we're just very lock in step with USSR. So when
they relied on the USSR for a lot of their goods and their imports and everything.
Yeah, because their economy was struggling without U.S. trade.
Right. And once we kind of cut them off after Bay of Pigs era, it was just kind of, they were really struggling. You can still find, like, I was reading articles, and we'll talk about this towards the end, of stories of people that live in Cuba that they still use old Russian appliances and stuff on the island because that's what was there
imported,
for so long.
And
Castro stayed around for a long time.
Yes. So in a way, right, when the Castro and he partnered with Che Guevara, who was from Argentina, he was a doctor who wanted to help people and saw how poor it was, and he kind of became this socialist communist figure. But the Castros and Guevara were, like, by no means peaceful. I mean, they had to take over by force, and in a way, Cuba kind of ended up trading one dictator for another, right? Because these guys, the Castros, did do some things that they promised to, like they did redistribute a lot of the wealth from the wealthy, and there was a lot of like education programs. And this is something that I know Bernie Sanders got in big trouble because he had mentioned something like, oh, well, Fidel Castro did have good education programs. And people were like, how could you ever say anything good about Fidel Castro? He did all these terrible things. And I mean, it's like sort of warranted, but that's not really what this is about. But the important thing to note is there were things that they did, but there were also a ton of oppression. Like, Guevara they were brutal. They, like I said, killed and imprisoned people, often without trial. There was like a big crackdown on LGBT
Oh yeah, I
people
mean,
there.
through all this, freedom of speech is not. It's still, well, yeah, not
Yeah,
much. We
yeah,
can talk about
because
that as we get
Che Guevara,
modern
he
era.
basically considered newspapers and the press to be like a tool of the oligarchy.
Right.
So there is still not really free press in Cuba today. And that's why, as we talk about this a little bit more, it's very hard to figure out what's actually going on in Cuba because there's no free press. And a lot of the numbers we get out of Cuba are suspicious and so on.
Yeah, it's really interesting that there's this blend, this weird blend. We'll talk more when we get to like modern era. I think there's a lot of things to look at. But yeah, eventually, I mean, I don't know if you want to touch on any of the special period, but went on throughout, the 80s and the Soviet Union and
Yeah, because once the Soviet Union collapsed, they
yeah,
were like even further into economic ruin and poverty.
right. And they did not accept anything from us at all, even when there was famine until 1993. So there was like 2 years of
Terrible famine.
terrible famine. Basically, I mean, this is just from their history. Like they ate like everything, and just it was
Zoo animals, house
yeah,
pets, like sad.
yeah. Eventually, things got better, and Castro, foreign visitors were allowed to come finally in the late 90s. But there's still like, even in the early 2000s, Castro cracked down on independent journalists and basically said, yeah, none of this is happening. They're all agents of the US. And then eventually he withdrew from public life and gave it to his brother in 2008, early 2008.
Yes. He kind of fell ill and was sort of unable to really
Right. Continue.
And so Raul Castro was kind of the acting president for 2 years, but it was officially handed over in 2008. And yeah. And then he was in charge until, when was it? 2012?
2012, yeah. Yeah,
Maybe.
2014. No, that was the whole Obama thing. Yeah, I don't know.
I'm clicking on it now. Let's see. Anyway, it was like, I think it was 2015, if I remember correctly. Okay, Raul Castro. Yeah, he was in office until 2018. It says.
Yeah, 18,
But
and then Miguel Diaz-Canel was in 19, and then now and he's still the current president.
Yes. So. Yep, he's the first one that has been a Castro in many years. Yeah, so it basically, after the Soviet Union collapsed, it was also partnered with Venezuela, which we all know is doing terrible.
Right.
Cuba has definitely struggled in a lot of ways. Do we want to talk a little bit about like current life there, or kind of life after the USSR's collapse?
Yeah, let's just kind of talk about kind of the pros and cons that we hear from both sides and kind of current life. I did some deep dives into reading stories by people that have lived there. There's a book I was interested in. It's like I can't remember the name of it. I was trying to look it up earlier. But basically just outlining all these different stories of different people that have lived in Cuba throughout these different eras, and just sharing like what their lives were like. There's one story that was in the Independent that was very pro Cuba from Fidel Castro's era, and just kind of talking about how everyone has access to all of these things: free healthcare, free water, free movies, and everything, because everything's owned by the government, so they can control all these prices. So like movies are super cheap, public transportation is super cheap, all this stuff is super low cost. And so he was saying, no Cuban would want to not have those things. But then I also read plenty of stories on the other side that's just like freedom of speech and access to basic what we would think of as very normal amenities today are
Right.
just not available.
Yeah.
And there's so much like, okay, yeah, they have access to all these things, but none of them are near as good as they would be in a traditional capitalist society. And they don't have access to anything better.
Right.
And I think as a Christian, I was reading about a lot of the freedom of religion stuff that they have, and a lot of are like culturally Catholic, but in general, it is very much cracked down on freedom of religion. There, one of my coworkers, he knows this pastor that we actually interviewed for one of our newsletters editions, and he left in 2016, I want to say, came to the US, but he was arrested several times for sharing his faith. Every time
in Cuba.
in Cuba, yeah. And when Obama came to visit, or whenever like big foreign leaders would come to visit, they would lock up for a couple of days a lot of like the dissenters, and so he was arrested when he was trying to share kind of what was going on and how he couldn't share his faith very often. He was trying to do that when Obama was coming, and there's like video of him getting arrested by Cuban police and taken to prison. Anyway, so his story is worth reading, and is really cool. But yeah, so there's just kind of, there's different perspectives and different stories that are coming from different angles of the country.
Yeah, it definitely seems to be the case that a lot of the Cubans that have fled or have lived there recently, or Americans that have visited, just say that, like, yeah, it's a tough place to live. There's equality in the sense that, like, a lot of people have access to the same sorts of things, but in general, it's not good quality. Like you said, like food, there's long lines for food. There's
like a monthly pension, and then there's a monthly food amount, and there's it's all these regimented kind of things. One of the most honest, so I also did just like research on Reddit and Quora and a bunch of different places just to read stories of people, and there was
or at least alleged stories, right?
Yeah, alleged stories. Yeah, I don't know how much of this is true. It's just all personal observation, but I think it's worth just understanding, trying to hear from people that live there. And one guy who lived there for a couple of years was talking about, like, it is just a very simple life, if that makes sense. And just like, yeah, you have access to all of these things, but that's about it.
Right. It kind of feels like a light or a diet form of North Korea, right? Like North Korea, it's like extremely closed, and I'm sure they have like very basic things that they're allowed, but there's no freedoms really. And then Cuba seems like a diet version of that. Like they have a little more variety. People are allowed to go, because I think until 2013, Cubans could not leave the country unless they were authorized by the government, and that was often denied. And officially, you can leave now. I don't know, maybe it's more complicated than that, but at least on paper, you're allowed to leave. But yeah, it's very hard to get gasoline, and I'm sure there's plenty of corruption. I know that like they have free healthcare, but if something happens to you, like you're not allowed to sue the doctors, and it just sounds scary.
Yeah, no, for sure. There's a lot of craziness. I think it's going to be interesting to compare it to when we do other countries. I know there's countries, I think it's Singapore, that has also low levels of freedom of speech, and kind of like a lot of the First Amendment kind of stuff that we think of in the US, but they have a very, very prosperous economy, and it's very wealthy. So it'll be interesting to kind of compare like why that is there, and maybe the state-owned business and all that kind of stuff that really makes the difference. But yeah, it's super interesting.
Yeah, and I think kind of viewing all of this history, at least to me, it seems like, okay, well, the state system of production is not really working. Like, I think a lot of people, even who are more left leaning, would say, yeah, we don't ever want what Cuba has, which is like state controlled. We prefer like a mix or
Right.
something like that. But I think on top of that, we have to give Cuba some credit, like it has been through the ringer in every sense of the word. And not only does it have state-owned industries, it's also has no trade with the U.S. and
Yeah, for
very
being an
limited
island,
trade.
like for being in the place it is, it didn't have the infrastructure that a place like America has and the ability to rely on itself near as much. It's done impressively well. And so I would definitely take it like, it's not one of the worst places to live on it's not one of
Right.
the places in the world.
Yeah, it seems like one of those things where, like, if the Cuban government decides it's interested in something, it will be able to pour resources into it, like they have been developing COVID vaccine, for example.
Right.
But again, like the morality of that kind of comes into question when a lot of the people there do live in poverty or have just very few choices or ability to go to school, get gasoline. Like, is that really your priority? But that's kind of how it is when your government is large. Like, it gets to pick and choose
Right.
what
What
the
the
activities are
priorities
going to
are.
be.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And yeah, I think just that freedom of press and freedom of religion just are so
Yes.
key in my mind to like a prosperous society. And I think that is since that is so lacking, I just see that as a big negative, which I think just comes with the fact that a state controlled, or often comes the fact of a state control, because once you control other aspects, you want to control that as well. Or it's hard to control the other stuff without controlling that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So.
There's very little free press, or no free press, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know if it's all government run, but I just know that there's really not a lot.
Let's see. I read something interesting. I'm pulling that
Yeah, the
up.
media is basically there's 3 national newspapers, 4 national TV stations, and like 5 radio stations, and they're all government run, pretty much.
Yeah, it looks like only 25% of Cubans use the internet, while only 5% of homes are connected, making it one of the America's least connected countries.
Which is wild when you think of like how much do so you may have these basic things provided for to keep you alive, but it's not prospering like a lot of other Central and South American countries that have access to the internet and just their cell phones and all of the 21st century stuff.
Right. Ranks very low on the Press Freedom Index.
Right.
Prohibits private ownership of media. Yeah.
So I wanted to touch on briefly, so I've seen, and this is from some conservative author, but he was posted these UN Sustainable Development Goals in 2017 and kind of noted like Cuba is listed fairly high and the US is listed fairly low. And at first glance, it's like, oh, that's really interesting. And you kind of see it's all color coded and you can compare the different things. And it's pretty easy to see, you might just assume like, oh, okay, this is cool. But I think it's worth like looking into these things and defining the stuff behind them, which we should do that for everything. Right.
Yes.
But like, the US ranks mid to low in poverty levels and the Cuba ranks high. And it's like, what does that mean? Poverty, basically how they define it in this study is equality and like the levels of, so even if the poverty is not as high, like as long as they're equal. So it's just kind of interesting to see the difference in how they define things. Or the climate action is considered much, much higher in Cuba because they don't produce emissions and they don't produce all of these things. But it's also because they're tiny and they don't have the means of production.
Right. They're not set up to do that.
Yeah. So it's just pretty interesting.
Yes.
So I just thought those were worth mentioning because I've seen that before in other studies, like these poor South American countries or whatever, rated as much higher than the US, and that makes me wonder why. But at least,
absolutely.
It may be true, but it's worth looking at the reasons behind those things.
Yeah. So. Well, I'm very curious to sort of see where the Cuban economy goes from here, and
especially with this new private businesses and kind of changing a lot of
Yeah.
change. So
We'll see if it's actual change or just sort of paper change. Like, it's always kind of hard to tell with these nations. Sometimes
right.
these things take a while to go into effect. So we'll sit tight. I don't expect any drastic changes right away, but maybe a little bit. So
Yeah.
we'll see
It'll be
also
super
if
interesting.
the Biden administration, how it handles Cuba. Like, it will probably tend to follow more Obama's approach, which was trying to improve and not, it might remove them from the list of state sponsors of terrorism or whatever. Um, but yeah, it's very curious. Very
Which,
curious.
yeah, and I'm like pretty globalist, and so I would say, like, let's do what the U.S. can do, provided resources, like, to help lift these nations up, because they also have goods and services that are like worth trading for, and like, like, let's
Open up the
do it.
markets,
Yeah, let's
right?
open up the markets, exactly. So
Yeah, it's going to be curious. All right.
anything else about Cuba? Thanks for
Um,
hanging with us on the
yeah.
history stuff. But I think,
Yes.
yeah, it's just, I really enjoyed just reading stories and getting to understand the culture a little bit more. And I mean, obviously, I have a lot to other things to learn about it, but
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It was very interesting. It's one of those things with socialism, like, that we have a few of these socialist countries, but a lot of them tend to uh, come with just terrible human rights, and you sort of, when you're debating socialism, it just seems very true that, like, well, we haven't really had a socialist state that didn't have terrible human rights violations. So because of the human rights being so terrible, it's never gotten along well with the U.S. and other trade partners, and because of that, it's kind of crippled its economy. And again, it's like,
right.
it's hard to have that pure case study on socialism when it's like such has such baggage attached to it.
Yeah,
But
exactly. It can't, it's not a
yeah,
true closed system. So we'll never really know. In that, yeah, there's no good one example. So, yeah, I'm definitely interested to look at European economies, those kind of northern Scandinavian countries that have much more socialist systems than
yeah,
the U.S. does, although they wouldn't
yes,
be considered true socialism
right,
compared to somewhere like Cuba.
yeah,
But I'm excited to take a look at that and
yeah.
compare
Hopefully,
them.
it's something we can
So
return to here and there for sure.
yeah,
All right. I think it's my week for recommendation.
it is. Do you have a recommendation for us?
Yes, I do. I have sort of two half recommendations.
Okay, so you
The
can
first,
do half of it.
yeah, seriously. So the first is this is not the first time I've recommended Taylor Swift, but she is releasing a bunch of her old albums. Like, Fearless
Oh
is
yeah, I
getting
read that today.
remastered. Yeah, so the first song is coming out. I think it's Love Story. It's coming out tonight at midnight, so it should be out by the time this airs. So I'm recommending that in advance. But you should go
Hopefully it's
check
good. I
out.
don't know why it wouldn't be good, because Love Story is a fantastic song.
And then, have you ever heard of the band, or maybe it's just the one guy, Bleachers?
I don't think so. Sounds vaguely familiar.
So Bleachers, I think it's just one guy. It's I let me see.
Oh, he's got a song with Bruce Springsteen. Interesting.
He's got a bunch of stuff. So, really interesting band. I knew this one song from Bleachers called "I Want to Get Better." It's a
Okay.
tremendous song. Okay, Google says it counts as a pop band, so it's not just one guy. But basically, the guy who's the front man for it, his name is Jack Antonoff, and he was in the band Fun, which obviously
Oh yeah.
Fun had huge hits.
Yeah.
So he was a big part of Fun, or I guess an integral part of Fun. Went on to do the Bleachers. He's done other stuff. He worked extremely closely with Taylor Swift on Folklore, and if you
Just one of the guys that did help with folk. Yeah.
so if you watch the
Okay.
Folklore thing on Disney Plus, he's like the guy that has the white shoes and the younger guy, and he was a big part of that. He's really talented.
Okay.
I've been listening to a bunch of the hits by Bleachers. You should check them out. They're kind of, I don't know what to call it. They're kind of poppy. Indie pop is
It's
what
similar to
everyone's
Colony
calling it.
House, Coin. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, kind of like fun, but more indie. Like,
Yeah, more indie.
because like fun isn't straight pop, but it's definitely. Anyway, it's really good. The songs are great. I Want to Get Better is amazing. Don't Take the Money's great. 45 is great. Good Morning's great. Like, they're all great.
Cool. All right,
that's my recommendation. You want to give us an outro?
Yes, thank you so much for joining us, and hope you learned a little bit about Cuba today, or at least were spurred to do some more research yourself. And I think this could be a fun series. We are Critical Conversations. You can find us on YouTube as our video version. You can find us on Spotify and Pocket Casts and all other places where podcasts are found for the audio version. We are on Facebook at Critical Conversations. You can follow us there to get updates when the episodes air. And yeah, this has been another good week. So
yeah, thanks for watching, guys.
Yeah.
Or listening.
All right.
See you next week.